Hello. Welcome everyone to day 3 of the Crossing Fonds Symposium. My name is Paul Hebard. I'm the University Archivist here at SFU. I want to start with a territorial acknowledgement today. We respectfully acknowledge that our symposium hosted here at SFU, Surrey, is taking place on the traditional unceded territories of the Semiahmoo, Katsi, Kwantlen, Kukite, and Tawasin nations. We recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land and acknowledge the injustices they have faced and continue to face as a result of colonialism and ongoing anti-Indigenous racism. I think it's our hope that the Crossing Fonds Symposium provides a space in which Indigenous voices and concerns about the interplay between data sovereignty, academic research, and archival practice are foregrounded to the benefit of all who participate in the symposium and who can take an active interest in the multidisciplinary topics discussed here over these 4 days. So I want to welcome everyone again to day 3. I'm going to ask everyone to take some time over the symposium to have a look at the Crossing Fonds platform. It's available from the symposium website. And there's a usability survey. We really want your feedback, especially what you don't like about it or what you want it to be able to do that it can't do right now. Love to have that feedback. I'm going to remind everyone that the event is live streamed and some of the sessions will be recorded. And please turn your phones to mute. I thought we'd maybe just begin with a little bit of a recap of the themes from today's session. And I want to throw it out to the audience as well. But from my point of view, when I think back on yesterday's talks, there's a lot of talk of transparency. I thought that was a theme. So transparency in AI, transparency in archival practices, transparency in the visualizations and open source tools that we use. I thought there was a lot of talk about thinking creatively and imagining what might be. So it was very future focused, less about what we're doing right now, but what we might be able to achieve. A lot of talk about moving away from static or rigid or unidirectional information flows towards dynamic and multi-directional information flows. And sort of against that was sustainability, maybe keeping everything static. So I thought that was interesting. Lots of talk about different open source platforms. We talked about Omeka S, ArcLight, Atom, Collective Access, and the Canadian Urban Data Catalog. Activism was a theme yesterday. Activism in labor, and queer studies, Indigenous activism. So those were sort of the main themes that I saw yesterday. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in and talk about themes that stood out to them. Sarah?
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, always ready to chat. Yeah, I mean, I loved yesterday, so thank you everybody who presented and who asked questions. I mean, I think the tension between generous interfaces, I'm just going to do this. So generous interface design, which is what Marian Dork was talking about, and then Joey Takeda's very practical, realistic, how do we build digital humanities environments that will be available in the future, given constrained resources and given constrained resources, but also change in technology platforms. So if something is less interactive, it actually can be a more effective record. I thought was a really important and crucial conversation. And that whole conversation about generous interfaces actually drove part of the dialogue in our SSHRC grant that we eventually got. So I think that's worth highlighting, and I think it'll flow throughout the conversation. And we just edged into AI as a discussion, and we're not going that deeply into AI over the next days. And I think we need to keep coming back to it in some ways. And, you know, it tends to be polarized as a friend or foe conversation. And I mean, I work in that space, and I'm working with Indigenous communities in that space to some extent. And I think we have to depolarize it and figure out how communities historically who have been excluded from technology development can be in the forefront of actually building technologies that serve them. So I just wanted to say that because we sort of touched it. And I also promised I would provide Sydney with a list that can be placed online of resources around algorithmic and data bias, and some of the folks who are actually doing some important research to think critically within that. So I thought that was an emerging theme. I mean, I think you captured it, Paul. I just think people are just sort of waking up still. I mean, for people who went to the Vivo event last night, it was just great to see the almost hallucinogenic experimental ways that artists are dealing with the archive. And all of the artists who were included are people who come from and have lived within and grown up within equity-seeking communities and groups. And it's just, artists have been working with archives for a long time. And I think sometimes that gets forgotten. It's been a huge movement for the last 20 years or so, particularly. And so there are some works that are online at Vivo that you can look at that are longer, and you can find them. If you make your way back to Vivo, Karen and I curated an exhibition of the more experimental works from the Sorwalk history and the Women's Labor History Project. So I just think it's a nice counterbalance to what can feel like a very rational, always rational conversation about the archive. And then the last thing I'll say is that it was just so clear yesterday and also in the workshops how archivists just really care. Not only about the record, but also about how to rethink the record and all those discussions about integrity of the record, and at the same time thinking critically about it and redescribing it. The final thing I'll say is the students were brilliant. Wherever you are, hello, brilliant. And it was one of the really big goals of this symposium when we put it together and we did the call for proposals. We were so worried we wouldn't get student proposals coming in, and we were flooded. And so it's just great to have that. I'm getting all teary. It was just great to have that quality of work, come in. So my question, and I didn't say this to the students, but I was saying it to some people this morning, is what is your project ending strategy for your work as students? How are you going to retain those archival instances that you're creating, and how do you either pass that on when you graduate, or look at how to, keep them somehow alive? I'm looking at the students, for us as we go forward. So something for you to think about. Okay.
Thank you so much. All right. Yes. Please.
Thanks. I just wanted to add one thing that I thought of yesterday was this about the idea of sustainability, is to be aware that a lot of the funding agencies have changed over, especially SSHRC, for example, has changed their requirements for data preservation and privacy when you're doing research projects now. And that's something to be aware of as far as the digital infrastructure you're using if you're creating like projects similar to Crossing Fonds, that you have to be aware that you need to be not only making your data secure for your project, but then how do you preserve it over time due to the requirements of your grant funding. So it's something to consider.
Okay, we forgot, we managed to erase that whole conversation, which is, because I hate it so much, but is how do you keep this work funded, right? So I think that's a thread that should get picked up as we move forward over today and tomorrow, which is to really think about how to work with funding agencies and help them understand how critical building the infrastructure and retaining it is, as well as doing the actual content and methodology-based research. So back to you.
And that was something that I picked up on as well, is again, talking about what's possible. It was touched on just a few times, but to me, one of the silences of yesterday was all of these things cost, and we didn't talk a lot about the practical aspects of implementing some of these really creative solutions. Yeah, so hopefully we'll talk about that a bit more today. So again, welcome to day 3, and I think we're gonna get ready for our next speaker.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dana Claxton, and I'm a professor as well as head of the Department of Art History, Visual Art, and Theory at the University of British Columbia. It's nice to be here with all of you, and I look forward to the day. So we have Kristin Kozar, who's a proud member of the Halitsum First Nations with familiar ties to Penelakut, Lummi tribe, as well as Musqueam in Vancouver. She is a 2018 Masters of Liberal and Information Studies graduate with a concentration in First Nations curriculum. She has previously worked at what was formerly known as the UBC Aboriginal Health and was working on a project where she researched and analyzed how to use blockchain to have Indigenous peoples' communities' autonomy over their own records. Kristin's currently also working on her PhD with a focus on Indigenous data sovereignty and residential school records at UBC in the iSchool. Her current role as the Executive Director of the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center at UBC, she brings her lifelong journey of advocating for Indigenous rights and Indigenous-focused engagement. She further brings experience in policy development, community relations building, and strategic planning. She takes great pride in endeavoring to indigenize the archive and information practices, while also pushing back on the colonial systems and institutions that assisted in developing them. So welcome.
Squayal, everyone. Good day, everyone. I don't have slides for today. My computer and I had a disagreement last night, and my computer won. So, how I'd like to start off is to say how truly humbled I am to be here today. And also to acknowledge, as was already done, but I'm going to do it as well, that we are currently learning and listening and collaborating here today on the traditional, ancestral, and stolen territories of the Katzie, Tsawwassen, Kwakwaka'wakw, and Semiahmoo nations. So prior to beginning my talk, I'm going to traditionally introduce myself. My name is Kristin Kozar, and I am the daughter of Rocky Wilson. I am the granddaughter of Rose Cook and Andrew Wilson, who his traditional birth name was Claxton. Because of what I'll be talking about today, I'm also going to relay that I am an intergenerational survivor. My ancestors went to Cooper Island and to Cheam Indian School in the States. And as I go throughout my talk today, you will understand why I'm relaying this information. So what I'm going to be going over today is what the work we do at the center is, how Indigenous data sovereignty intertwines with that, as well as projects and programs we have started there in order to better take a step forward in regards to indigenizing and honoring Indigenous people when it comes to their data. Okay, so prior to beginning, what I will note is, and what I ask is to prepare your hearts. Some of the things I'm going to be discussing are difficult to hear. I suggest and I encourage to be comfortable in the uncomfortableness of this topic. And if you need to take a moment to step out or what have you, please do so. Take care of yourself, because that you and your wellness is the #1 priority. Okay. So at the center, I'm going to note that our specific mandate is to address the colonial histories and the ongoing impacts of residential schools and other policies that have been imposed by our Canadian government on Indigenous people across Turtle Island. And we are there to assist in awareness of these unjust colonial systems that still affect us very much today. So much of the work that we do includes facilitating dialogues and enhancing access to records and information that support and engaging the historical harms, but also the ongoing ones that continue. So additionally, and I will speak more to this in a little bit, we have developed the oral testimony program that ensures the experiences of those who attended residential schools and were directly affected by them and other institutions are recorded, preserved, and made accessible for future use. But how this program is run is one of the first of its kind. Before jumping in, I would like to give a snapshot of what Indigenous data sovereignty is, though I would like to give the caveat that I, as a single individual, cannot give a definition for that, and I'm going to explain why. So there's the definitions of Indigenous data sovereignty that we can see on the Canadian government website of what they think it is, and as well as ongoing conversations with First Nations and what have you, and those who have written on it and those who are in it. The caveat I'll note is that every single nation, First Nation in this country is sovereign by itself. And so to switch and to flip that discussion on that, it should be up to each and every single nation to define what Indigenous data sovereignty is for themselves. So for instance, in BC, we have 204 First Nations currently. And with that, we have 204 distinct and sovereign nations within BC who have the right to define what data sovereignty for them looks like. And so what I will note about that, I'm going to take a step back to explain further, to define what that actually means. So when we are talking about sovereign First Nations, there can sometimes be a misunderstanding of what that actually means. I'm going to throw out some acts here that have been written and uphold the rights of Indigenous people. So in the Constitution Act of 1982, it notes that each nation has sovereignty over their own communities, as well as we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and we also now have UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, where in UNDRIP it specifically talks about data. And when we are talking about that legislation and those rights for Indigenous people, what that actually means is that when we're talking about a nation-to-nation relationship, is as Canada would have a relationship with the United States, whereas Canada would have a relationship with the UK. That is the same relationship that is representative of each First Nation in this country to Canada. Do we do a great job of actually upholding those rights? I'll leave that to you to ponder. So the reason that that's important is that when we are talking about sovereignty, and specifically Indigenous data sovereignty, those are rights. It is the inherent right of First Nations to be able to have their data, that the historical data that even the government has gathered, as well as current data that is researched and what have you on each of these nations. So when I discuss Indigenous data sovereignty, I do go broad strokes because of the fact that that ownership and is for each nation to define. But the other element of this is that we are talking about not just data that we see defined within not only archives and what have you, but in all areas. What we're also talking about is the relationship with data. And so when we talk about archives, it can be very static. I heard that word this morning already, and it can be very unilateral and without relationship incorporated. And so when I'm talking about Indigenous data sovereignty, or when it is often talked about with Indigenous data sovereignty, I'm looking over at my friend Kayla there, because I know we've had these discussions. The core and the crux of that is the relationship and the care it takes with the data. That's not only the data that's gathered on the land, that's that we're talking about oral histories, oral traditions, what I will talk about this in a little bit, but blood memory and what have you, and those ancestral ties that flow through, this is what we're talking about and how it's incorporated. And I understand that's a very large topic to be discussing, but when everything is relational, and when we are talking about that as well, something cannot stand alone. Like when we see a record in archive, and we have historically, we've had these descriptions made of whether it's pictures or of records and what have you, with no context to actually what took place. It really is an ill representation of what that record is. I had the honor of having an elder share with me that the records, for instance, that are held at the center, these are the relatives, the ancestors of some of these individuals. And the reason for that is because some of the pictures and the records that are represented in our collective access system are the only, whether it's a photo or a record or what have you, it's the only thing left of the individual. And so we do take great care to remember that, and when we're handling it, as well as trying to put into place areas where we can be in conversation with community so we can properly represent what they want when it comes to the records. So one definition that has been given about data sovereignty is that it's linked with Indigenous peoples' rights to maintain, control, protect, and develop their own cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as their right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over these. So with this, the other note I will make, and that because this conversation comes up frequently about data, is that there really has been a deficit approach historically when we are talking about Indigenous data, data that's used to show you know, the stereotypes of Indigenous people in the country. This still happens continually, and to what purpose, and to what acknowledgement or relationship with these nations. And so who does this benefit and who does this push down? And so it's being able to take a look from a different lens at these, at this data and at this information, as well as being in relationship, like I said, with these First Nations to discuss what the intent is, what the intent that the First Nations want to have this information, and as well as looking at it relationally and in context to actually what is happening in community. So yes, so we'll leave that there for now. An aspect of the center And I'm totally going to highlight her, and she's not going to love this at all because I do stand on the shoulders of the executive director who did go before me, Elizabeth Schaefer. And so, and and with that, we're able to continue the work at the center where we are remembering now that we are an Indigenous center. Though we're in a colonial institution, we are an Indigenous center. And to be able to assist and work with the First Nations communities in BC, we have to center that first and be in relationship with one another first at the center. So with this, we do trauma-informed practices. We bring people in to facilitate two-eyed seeing training and cultural safety. And this is so the colleagues that I work with, all of us can have a better understanding as we're working with these records, but also with First Nation communities. And that is something that is never a one-time thing. This is something that has to continually happen as we go with the work that we're doing. So further to that, as I noted, the sort of unwritten motto of the center is that we are in service to communities and for communities. And I've said this at previous conferences and had these discussions. It is not to UBC. It is for First Nation communities. That is our number one priority. And because of that, because we do centralize that, we've been able to walk alongside First Nation communities with lots of programs and projects, which I'm just going to briefly highlight here. And if anyone has any questions as I'm going through this, please feel free. So the first one I'm going to discuss where I am very, very proud of this is our oral testimony program. It took us 2.5 years to get this through Behavioral Research Ethics Board at UBC. I will say it was a very colorful process. And I will share why and why the program is so, in my opinion, revolutionary. So the oral testimony program, as I'm sure everybody recalls, in May of 2021, there was a news story that broke out and something that changed not only Canada as a whole, but the lives of many Indigenous people for the rest of history and contemporary times, which was the beginning of the recovery of the 215 missing children at Kamloops. And so with that, I would like to say revved up the oral testimony program and to push it through to be able to, again, be in service to First Nation communities. And so with this, the whole intent of it is to be able to record oral truths, whether it's survivors' testimonies from residential schools or day schools, from Indian hospitals, from child welfare, but to be able to be in service to these First Nation communities. The caveat with this is that we wanted it to be completely and utterly First Nation led. And so that means that if communities wanted to come to us and just ask to borrow equipment, that was okay. If they wanted to come to us and ask us to build a whole program so we could, from beginning to end, to record the oral truths from survivors, we could do that as well. a huge aspect of this is that we wanted to have in there as well that First Nations communities, after these recordings have been done, that if they so desired, they could take those recordings completely and have ownership, and that they needed to have ownership from the very beginning. And we have now been able to do this. And so if we use collective access at the center. So if First Nations communities, again, or individuals want to keep that that recording with us, they can, where no one else has access. They can keep it with us in a transitionary period until they have their own data management system set up, or we can just give it over after all the recordings are done. And so the aspect I'm going to note when it comes to ethics is we had my co-lead in the oral testimony program, David McAtechnie, and I, we had 5 sessions, which were approximately like 4 hours each, with the BREB to explain what we were trying to do. Because frankly, the ethics application that is set up at UBC is not set up for Indigenous ways of knowing. And so we endeavored in this. What I can say is I lift my hands to the BREB because they really did want to understand. They came and they listened and what have you. But aspects such as knowing how the recordings would happen and what have you, and with the relationship building, it doesn't give much room for that fluid relationship and what it takes to be in right relations. And so long story short, we did get it through. This is something we are able to do for communities. And of course, this also incorporates Indigenous data sovereignty. The other element I will talk about is, apologies, we do, in the work that we do, and it is very fluid and it shifts continually, is we have a partnership with the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation here in BC, and that is a government entity whose focus is strictly on working with First Nations communities where residential schools or Indian hospitals were on their territory in and to assist in finding the missing children. And so with that, it has really grown now because, of course, like every nation has different needs. They see different aspects in where they want to start first and what have you. And so with that, we've been able to walk alongside the ministry and the 21 lead communities to record oral truths, but also to assist or help in any way we can in getting better access to residential school records. And so when we are talking about that, access to residential school records is colorful. It's even being an archivist and trying to find these records, it is extremely difficult. And there has not been one tool that has been brought together to assist communities. And so the reason this is difficult is because these First Nations who are endeavoring on this, they put forth like a program lead or someone who will be doing this work. And we're not just talking about finding records and archives. We are talking aspects of ground penetrating radar. We're working on legislation and with the ministry in that area. So there's, in that one role, no one can be an expert in all areas. And so when it does come to the records, we were hearing over and over and over again was the difficulty in being able to gain access to these records, because the way our privacy legislation is a huge aspect of this, is focused individually on individuals and not from a collective aspect, right? Like as an entity of a First Nation. And so that is obviously a huge barrier, but also the fact in knowing the tools to use and what have you to find the records where they are. Because though they're not only at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, there's other archives, of course, where they are. It's also knowing what to look for. I think we all know, we all went to school to know how to look for these records, right? Where these individuals have not. So we at the center, we've hired someone who is specifically working on a toolkit for the 21 communities in BC to write a toolkit in layman's terms of where to find the records, who to contact, to actually have contact names, and for our center as well to be in relationship with these archives, so we could be an intermediary as these communities see fit to be able to find the records faster and gain access faster, as well as the records aspect of that. Like I said, we have done training for many of these First Nations with the oral testimony program. We freely give over any of the tools that we use, whether it's the consent form, whether it's how to set up a room for the recordings and what have you. And it's very much reciprocal relationship, and we come at this from the perspective of not only transparency but with care, and because without this, if we're all not doing our part with those who work in these areas, it's just going to make it that much more difficult for communities. So those are two of our largest programs or our largest endeavors at the center, but there's other aspects as well where we try to push back. Some of this is our data sharing agreement. Though this is not by any means complete, but where we are working with UBC to indigenize the data sharing agreement, because there are aspects where if we are holding records or oral truths and what have you, usually the caveat is that it's the university's property, right? And there are other caveats with that as well. And so we're now sitting at the table with UBC legal team in order to see how we can incorporate Indigenous practices and what have you that are also in line with the Indigenous strategic plan that UBC has. And then, of course, there's other areas where we are looking, like I had noted previously, like being in relationship with First Nation communities when it comes to descriptions and metadata and what have you, which is a long and arduous process because we have 204 First Nation communities in BC. So one moment. So as we're talking about that, I was going to discuss the frameworks in which the records are in which they operate in, but I'm not going to. But what I am going to note is that even 7 years ago, when I became passionate about Indigenous data sovereignty and knew what it was, it was one of those discussions I often had with other individuals where they heard Charlie Brown, like, wah, 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 like, what are you talking about? Where now there really is an incline when it comes to it, and there's other aspects of it where we're able to stand on the shoulders of even other nations like New Zealand, who have incorporated this not only within First Nations and operating systems within First Nations, but also within their own federal government. And so this is something, again, being in relationship with and intertwining those knowledges that we are able now to push back when we're told something can't be done or things are not feasible. Because I think the question isn't necessarily can it be done, it's more why not. And when we are talking about the rights of Indigenous peoples, what are those barriers that stand in the way? And instead of just dealing with it, it's about being able to be at the table and say, if this isn't working, if this is a Band-Aid approach, then we gotta destructure it and we have to rebuild it. And we are just starting to see the fruition of that when we're talking about Indigenous data sovereignty as across Turtle Island. So something I'm very excited about. But also, I wanted to note that there are various emerging Indigenous data sovereignty models around records and data. There's the First Nations principles of OCAP. I'm not sure how many people have heard of OCAP. I love the nods, which they can provide guidance. I will note they are not the end all and be all. That is something I share often, is that usually it is the bare minimum that the ethics board sees when it comes to OCAP and incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing and knowledge and relationship building. And when I say bare minimum, I mean bare minimum. I mean like talking with communities like 1 or 2 times, coming in with their own agenda and believing that's relationship building, where it's not. Relationship building, I often say time is a colonial mechanism, and I do believe that, because when your relationship building and you're building that trust and that transparency, you're discussing these areas with individuals who have been harmed over and over and over again by institutions. That's a fact. And so with that, it is up to the individuals who are working with the communities to build that trust. And from one community to the next, that could look like 2 or 3 times sitting down and breaking bread together and being in relationship, or it could take a lot longer than that. It could, and there's no set framework on how this works. It is something that has to be built on as you're working with communities, and it has to be completely up to them. Also to guide in how this work is done and how they want outside individuals to work with them. Another aspect of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action document aims as well at archival practices and international models, and those are the calls 67 through 70. So the secondary aspect I'm going to touch on here is the ability to create collective memory and collective identity and move away from the individual aspect of it is directly linked to confronting and interpreting a community's own past. And so what I often say when we're talking about records, even the records that we hold, other archives hold, not only that come to when we're talking about residential school records, but any other record that is held on Indigenous individuals and communities, is that these are fluid and they are living. They are part of the journey of individuals within the First Nations communities. But what I will also note is that I'm going to specifically talk about residential school records now, is that we have to keep in mind that though we put the record as the primary when it comes to historical facts and what have you, that isn't truth. And the reason I say that is one, I mean, we are missing a ton of records, whether they were, some were destroyed intentionally, others were destroyed unintentionally. But you also got to look at the aspect of who was writing these documents. And so I'm just going to give like a snapshot of this right now. But if you have those who are working in the residential schools, so whether it be the priests or the nuns or the Indian agents writing to federal officials for funding and what have you, the representation of what those schools were is not correct. And it's only through one very static viewpoint, not the experiences of those who were actually there. And so I note that, as well as the fact that some of these records we have come across, and this is just like one example, that have even attendance records and where the students came from are inherently like incorrect. Whether it's the spelling of names or where the communities came from, whether it was a lack of care in how it was written, or just not knowing, it doesn't really matter because it's incorrect. And so this also leads to the difficulty in finding some of these records because of the inconsistencies, I will say, throughout these records. And so with that, I'll note that flipping the switch to those survivor testimonies that we record and speaking to communities as a whole about what happened, that really is the primary. And it's the archival records that support that. It isn't the other way around because they are the experts. They're the ones who know. And it's something we are trying to transition to understand that, and for more and more individuals, academics, what have you, to understand that for voices that were not heard for so long and for histories that were not heard for so long, the highlight has to be what First Nation communities went through, but not only that, the intergenerational effects that came from that. And so those are what we consider the primary data, the primary record. So the other aspect I will note is there is a growing presence of Indigenous perspectives in historical interpretation that is reflected in First Nations communities establishing their own archives and their own traditional archival institutions. And I'm not going to name any First Nations communities, but there are quite a few, but also on the pushback when it comes to Indigenous data sovereignty and operating systems, because there is still this area where, though it is the sovereign right of First Nation communities to have their data and to have their records, there's oftentimes stipulations from the federal government to hand over these, such as what the data management system looks like, what is established, what have you. There is always a caveat as to why First Nations communities are not able to pull all of their information. The other note and I will end on this because I'm talky. Indigenous peoples do have an intimate relationship, a deep, intimate relationship to their information, to their knowledge, and to their data. That has often been seen as secondary and not as relevant as what can be written down. So I'm going to speak to blood memory here, and then I will close. And this is one aspect. This is something I know a little bit about because this is in my own community. But the idea that what we go through, what our ancestors have gone through and what they have walked through, but also their resilience and the power that they had at the time does flow down through blood memory. It's fluid. It doesn't ever extinguish. It stays with you. And that I'm not sure 100% how to explain it, but this aspect is really important when we're talking about information and data within communities, because it does not stay static with one individual or with one record. It is all encompassing. It is all together. That, like I said before, that includes land, that includes oral traditions, that includes trauma, that includes resiliency and pushback. But it isn't seen as a section, you know, when we look at timelines of history, you know, we see like this happened in 1896 and this happened in 1907. That's not the way many communities believe that it actually works. It's all incorporated together and kind of like a relational database. That's what I'll say. That's the closest thing I can note. And so with that, I will end. Now hand it back to Dana. I want to stand because, yep, I'm short. So.
Okay, I am as well.
Yeah.
Sure. So thank you for that.
Nice.
So I guess we will open the floor and see if there's any inquiries or questions or comments.
Just wanted to start by saying thank you with everything that you shared. A lot of this is very relevant to what I'm learning. I'm a graduate student right now, so this is something we talk about a lot. It's a big topic of conversation. So I'm just going to start by positioning myself. I am a settler archival researcher and the new professional in the field. So the question I have for you is, through experience, I've come into some institutions where there may be some older ideologies around archives and they're still, you know, deeply entrenched with some colonial practices. Is there any advice that you can provide for coming in as a new professional when you're having to introduce to people who've been working in the field to data sovereignty and what that means?
I love your question. I'm going to note, I'm looking at some of my former students. They know my opinion on this. So I do believe there's ways to push back. First, the fact that we do have legislation, I mean, UNDRIP by itself is enough to stand on to note to I'll say old archival theory when I'm trying to be very kind. old archival theory, and when it does come to new ideas or implementations, when talking about Indigenous data sovereignty. But it's also about bringing people around a table. And as a new professional, I understand it's very difficult, and especially as a non-Indigenous professional. But there is that aspect of it, and there's also the calls to action that we stand on, where it's incredibly, incredibly important to highlight, but also the fact of acknowledging to those old ideologies, that what will this look like if we don't do this, right? If you end up not doing something, as more and more archives are incorporating aspects of the calls to action, and they're getting consultations and what have you, what will it look like? Because that is more of the clincher, right? When you say that to someone in a leadership position in archives, what will this look like if we don't? And like, if this comes back and we have done nothing, or we have done minimal, what will this look like, and what will the reflection be on the institution? So that's my suggestion. You're welcome.
Okay, we have a question online from Brandon. And he says, thank you very much for your talk, Kristin. I was wondering if you may be able to speak to how Indigenous data sovereignty has affected the center's policy writing work and database system, the collective access, both of which are colonial processes and systems. In both instances, how is the idea of Indigenous ownership over their records implemented in such systems?
Okay, I'm gonna, I might ask you for the second part after, again, but how we are incorporating it now, we are endeavoring on policy writing right now and indigenizing policy writing. And in every aspect of this, Indigenous data sovereignty is incorporated. I'm looking at someone who's very much walking alongside me with this. Because it really is the central crux of everything we do. And if it isn't, then we are just another institution working with Indigenous communities, incorporating colonial practices. And so fully with the caveat though, like we are just starting on this. But when it does come to policies, practices, and protocols from the center, that is the central aspect, as well as we do use collective access. And so in that process, currently, we have started incorporating areas into collective access where, of course, First Nations communities can have their records, where they only view them, they only have access and what have you. So we are actually, not that this is the end all be all, but are spending the money to make sure that we are honoring each First Nation who comes to us with their records or with their oral testimonies, what have you. And that is a huge aspect that we are incorporating as well as we are endeavoring, because we don't have preservation in the center as of yet, but we are currently working on that as well, where Indigenous data sovereignty and those relational aspects are completely incorporated in.
And you
Does
got
that
the
answer the
second part of the
question?
question, so you're good.
Okay.
A question over here. Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Liza. I work at the Evergreen State College in Washington, and I have been working on a collection of a faculty member we had who was a member of the Lummi Nation, who had thousands of audio recordings from the 70s and 80s. And I'm new to kind of First Nations partnerships. And one of the things I've been thinking about is compensation, as we've been working closely with some members of the Lemhi Nation as well as her family. And to me, I see them as providing necessary unpaid labor. And so
Right.
looking at ways to possibly set up positions or honoraria. And I was curious if you had any thoughts about that or any practices that you're familiar with.
Yep, I do. First, I'm going to note, Lemmy is my fam jam, so I'd love to connect with you after just to see if you're actually working with a family member of mine from Lemmy. In that regard, it's absolutely imperative. Continually, Indigenous peoples have been extracted from and are so now. I think this is well-known knowledge, and if it's not, it should be. And the aspect I'll also note on that is it's not like this has stopped, right? Like we even see it in academic institutions when we have Indigenous faculty and Indigenous staff. So I wanna note that it's something to consider. When it does come to compensation, what we have done at the center is because we now have the Indigenous financial guidelines through UBC. We use that as a framework, though I still think it could use some work. And so we, sorry. And so at the center, we tend to be more generous and in conversation with the individuals that we're working with because they might not even want that. They might want something else. And so that's part of that relationship building and understanding what their desires are, and because it could be a plethora of things. So that would be my suggestion. Open the conversation, be transparent, put that aspect like on the table so you can actually discuss it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this, for an excellent and informative talk. I'm wondering if you can speak to, so the center is based at UBC and
Yes.
you've been talking about working with nations within the boundary of British Columbia. I'm wondering, are there other relationships in other provinces with other institutions, or
Yes.
I'm just trying to think of connecting with, you know, how someone in Alberta, where would they go, or where would someone in Winnipeg go, and how's some of the guidelines you're talking about, are they shareable with other
Yes,
nations and other provinces?
If I forget something, let me know. We do have partnerships and relationships with other institutions. We do have a partnership with the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation. We have and continue to work with Xinguang as well. And so I also want to note, because I always think it's really, really important to highlight that we have a partnership with the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. Even though that's not in regards to records, I think it's really important to raise my hands to them. And so we do have relationships and partnerships with other institutions. In regards to what you're asking about, like if someone comes to us in regards to records in Alberta or wherever, we do use a trauma-informed approach where we are in conversation with them, because I think we all know it's extremely frustrating to go from one place to another, to another, to another. And that is part of the toolkit I was talking about. And so where we are in collaboration and discussion with other institutions and what have you to assist. And so it wouldn't simply be telling the individual, go here, what have you, have a good day, that's it, right? It's gaining that information and then us taking on the conversation with the institution to be in touch with the individual. So it is more relational, and it isn't requesting for the same information over and over and over again. And in regards to, or is this something that we will be sharing? Everything we have at the center is transparent. It's supposed to be there for the betterment of First Nations communities. So yes, it will be. It's not complete yet, but it will be. Mhm.
And we do have one final question online. It's a
Okay.
quick one. So Marianne, thanks you for your insights, and also is curious about what you would like to see changed or incorporated into the ethics review process.
Such a good question. Oh, and I love that it was asked. So, uh, um, I'll start with noting that after this colorful, long process that we went through, I do think it was fruitful. And like I said, I do hold my hands up to the BRAB for being willing to come to sit with us and understand and what have you. But what has come out of that now is that UBC BRAB has now, I'm walking alongside them because they want to have a completely separate application process, not only with working with Indigenous communities, but for Indigenous researchers, because the approaches are different, obviously. And so it's still very much in the making. But this is something that they are trying to endeavor on. My desire for sure would be that that not only happens, but when they are doing it, how incredibly imperative it is to be in conversation, not only with First Nations individuals like faculty and staff and students at UBC, but they also need to be in conversation with the First Nations communities in BC where the research is being done. Like, we send our students to communities, right? We know this is happening and what have you, and how we train and teach our up and coming academics on how to do this has to be done better. And I think it's improved quite a bit, but it is not where it needs to be. So that's what I would like to see.
Oh,
Nope.
sorry.
You keep doing this. I know.
So my question was, when you talked about the privacy legislation
Mhm.
and in terms of the individual, and it's not sort of collective, I'm curious about what kind of changes you think are possible with the privacy legislation in terms of your research and residential school.
That's a really good question. Okay, so what I'll note is I had the honor and the privilege of talking, I think last year, it was last year, at the special interlocutor event. For those who don't know, the special interlocutor, Kimberly Murray, is the intermediary between the federal government and all of the First Nation communities in Canada who are working to find the missing children. And I did speak on Indigenous data sovereignty at this conference, as well as, of course, many other individuals in this regard. And when we're talking about not only privacy legislation, but how fundamentally access to archival records, there's so many barriers there. I do think it's possible, and I think this more so because Kimberly Murray said it as well, that those legislations, those whatever they are, can be destructured. Like this is not, it's not out of the question, and they can be rebuilt with Indigenous perspectives. And the reason I say, and I feel like not only that this can be done, because if there ever was a time when it could happen, it's now. But the other aspect of it is we've done the Band-Aid approach for decades, when it comes to Indigenous rights and highlighting, the collective entities of First Nations, and nothing has worked. Nothing has worked. The Band-Aid approach doesn't work when you have a fundamental colonial structure, such as legislation pertaining to access to records that come from an individual perspective. There is little to no room for a Band-Aid approach, because what it's going to be is it's going to be an amendment. But what's going to happen is there's going to be a disparity between what the articles note, what the legislation notes, and to what actual Indigenous rights are. And what has happened fundamentally over and over and over again is when that happens, the colonial structure takes precedent. And so it has to be destructured, and Indigenous voices need to come to the table, and their rights need to be uplifted. And I think that's the only way we're going to see the changes that are necessary, but that are also the inherent rights. Like, I can't emphasize that enough of Indigenous communities. So. Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much.